Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining me and the Hackney Society for a presentation about Hoxton, which is really about a timeline of the history of the area, but how it all works together to end up where we are now. So my name's Carolyn, as I said, and I co-wrote the Shoreditch Tales, and you can see a copy of my book there. But I've also lived and worked in Shoreditch for many years, so I know the area from the 1970s onwards. So very quickly to run through Hoxton, it started off, as most places do, as very rural. But a key thing about Hoxton was it's sandwiched between two Roman roads. And so it was always a way station from Roman times, but there was little settlement. It's also an outskirt, right on the edge of the city, but also a fair distance from it. And so it became a country retreat. And then there was an attempt to make it a garden suburb, in a way, a north end, like there was a west end, which we'll be talking about. It became a suburb of Sin, possibly my favourite period, an industrial hub. Then it lurched into being a classic inner city, a loft district, and of course where we are now. And there's a big question mark after that one. So starting off in the very early days, when there was just a bit of development around, in 1502, and you'll see that this lasted till 1845. So some of the things I'm going to talk about actually went on a very long time. Just at the junction of Great Eastern Street and Old Street, on Old Street itself, where the tea factory was a baths. Now, the clue to Shoreditch, the name, was that it is said to be sewer ditch, i.e. A small stream. And Shoreditch did in fact have many streams, and they created water to provide a spa bath. And so it was a venue that people came to for many years to enjoy the waters. And I just love at the bottom that it used to be for a hot bath, it was 2 bob, and for a cold bath it was 1 bob. So pity the poor people who ended up in the cold baths. Now, in the early days, the people who moved, and this is Tudor times when it was actually a very nice place to live, there were a number of people moved there, about 20 houses along Hoxton Street, and this is Lord Monteagle. You will see I've made him a Hoxton hipster because he was one of the first people to move in. So I've added a Hoxton quiff and a dog. But he lived there in 1600s, and one of the reasons that Lord Monteagle is famous is he actually exposed the gunpowder plot. Although he was Catholic himself, but he got a message and actually passed it on. You then had 500 years of theatre in Shoreditch. It was actually banned, plays were banned from the City of London because they were said to be rowdy and create problems. And so in 1577, the theatre was built in Shoreditch, and this is an image from it. And on the right, you can see Ralph Fiennes when he was performing Shakespeare at the Gainsborough Studios, which was taken over by the Almeida Theatre just before it became luxury flats, yet more luxury flats by the Canal, in the old Gainsborough Film Studios. So there's been 500 years of a tradition, theatrical tradition in Shoreditch. And I'm just going to run on that because in 1858, the Britannia Theatre was built on the old Pimlico tea gardens in Hoxton Street. And you'll see it was, you could not imagine nowadays this being in the heart of Hoxton, but it was. It was visited by all sorts of famous people, including Dickens, who actually compared it to La Strada and talked about a firmament of chandeliers lighting it. And also he talked about the sweet smell of the theatre, because at that time so many actually had very poor ventilation. And you can see there's three floors of people, and obviously the locals ended up on the top floors, and the guests like Dickens ended up in in the down below. And these theatres used to perform everything. I mean, they do Shakespeare, they do tragedies, they do pantomimes. They also had boxing in them, in some of them. And in 1900, there were 7 theatres in Hoxton. This is another one. This is in 1901, and this was the London Music Hall in Shoreditch High Street. I mean, some of these, we say theatres, they were also music halls, and sometimes they were called penny gaffs. They tend to be the low rent ones, and some of them were very close to being strip joints. But they attracted people from far and wide, and when you think there were 7 and they were sort of pretty full every night, you can see it was a large industry, and local people did go to them. They went to watch Shakespeare as well as the boxing and the other entertainments. So going back from the years of entertainment to the very beginnings of Shoreditch as a residential area, we go back to 1680s when someone had the bright idea of developing residential garden squares in Hoxton. And this was along Old Street, which by then was surrounded by fields. And in fact, most of them were by now market gardens. And you'll see Hoxton Square with the marketplace, now often called Hoxton Market, next to it, and Charles Square on the left. I'm not going to talk much about Charles Square. To be fair to it, it's now mainly modern residential developments with one historic house at number 16, which was built in 1726, still standing. And that's got a preservation order on it, and it's well worth having a look. But Hoxton Square was developed with very beautiful buildings around the garden. This is the inside of 23 Hoxton Square. You can see beautiful panelling, no expense spared. And this, although this is taken in 1920, so it doesn't scrub up so well. But you'll see this building here, which is number 48 Hoxton Square, and you'll see what charming houses they were for people to live in. This site actually became the White Cube, so this building is no longer with us. But they were very good buildings, but they didn't prove popular. I don't think people fancied coming over to the East End even then. As you know, in London, the prevailing wind from the west tends to create the smells and pollution in the east, and so the Hoxton Square developed at the same time as religious dissenters and nonconformists were actually being persecuted within the City of London. And so it's an ideal location for them to just pop out of the city walls and into Hoxton Square to continue their activities. So despite the fact there were lovely houses, Hoxton Square did not draw the people in that they expected. And I put at the top of this slide synonymous one, because one of the things when you read up about Hoxton is it becomes synonymous with so many things. Now, this isn't a word I normally use, but time after time, synonymous in Hoxton came together. And so this is the first of my synonymouses, and it's synonymous with dissent. And in 1798, in the history of Shoreditch, Hoxton Square has been remarkable as the residence of many eminent nonconformists and other dissenting divines. And this image, and it's still standing, is of 32 Hoxton Square. It's the oldest building in Hoxton Square, and it was the site of the first Hoxton Academy in 1699. Now, there's quite a lot of people who just assume that religious dissenters spent all their time being religious. But in fact, some of them were illegal, of course, and so therefore they were devoting their lives to something that was quite risky. But the academies were actually set up to rival Oxford and Cambridge as places of education, and they had a very wide curriculum, which included languages, mathematics, natural and moral philosophy, geography, history and law. And although there was ministerial education, it was usually free inquiry by students. So they're actually quite liberal, and of course the discussions went far beyond religion and into the political sphere. And that was a similar reputation that Hoxton Square had acquired. But of course the conformists then fought back. The nonconformists were attracting followers, and so the conformists moved back into Hoxton Square. So St Peter's was built there, one of the last churches in the area, in 1874, and had a vicarage at 10 Hoxton Square. St Leonard's Vicarage was moved to Hoxton Square, number 36, and the image was a drawing from 1844 of the St Leonard's Vicarage. As you can see, it looks a very pleasant place. And then in 1866, St Monica's Mission to the Poor created a church priory school combination. It's quite interesting because St Monica's is, of course, Catholic. And when we looked at Lord Monteagle earlier, and also one of his neighbours was the Portuguese ambassador, they were Catholics who were escaping persecution themselves as Catholics to Hoxton. So by 1866, they were becoming conformists in themselves. And here's the photo. You can see on the left the school, in the middle of the church, and on the right is where they had the Augustine monks. On the school has a very interesting history. It started out as a school, and then it became a nursery when it became taken over by the local authorities. In the 1980s, the GLC gave it over as a Latin American centre. There was dancing in the square from that centre. Then it became Bob Bree Martial Arts Gym, where they trained Mounties, and people locally used to enjoy seeing the Mounties arrive to train. And it also became an architect's live-work base in the 1990s. In the 2000s, it became a social enterprise training cafe, the Hoxton Apprentice. And it's now flats, you can see the penthouse on the roof there, commercial restaurant and design studios. One of the reasons that the Catholic development was so large is that the population in Shoreditch between 1800 and 1850 had actually quadrupled, and a large number of the migrants were from Ireland, and there were also a fair number of Italian migrants who'd come to work in the ice wells or run some of the cafes. And the next image is of the Bergonzi family, and you'll see that they're already there for Holy Communion at the church, which was a very popular venue for all sorts of things as well. They actually did have boxing there, and there was a boxing tradition in the Italian community. And people remember playing bingo, and I met one man who was an altar boy, and they used to get, it was almost like points mean prizes. When you're an altar boy, you got an allocation of a certain number of points, and afterwards you could claim or save up for things. And he actually bought a fishing rod with his altar boy fees or whatever. And against the backdrop of all this sort of religion, Shoreditch had acquired a reputation and the moniker of suburb of sin. So in the 1700s, people used to leave the city to come here to take the air, and also have alehouses, gaming houses, ragged queens and cut purses. I love the phrase ragged queens, you all know what that means. There's little talk actually of the people who were living there before, because although there were farmlands and things, people don't talk about the number of people who would have been working on them. But there were early reports around 1500 of resistance from people from the city who went to practice archery and ride their horses on the land. and would run roughshod through the fields where people were trying to farm. And there was a time that the farmers tried to build fences and dig ditches, and the mob from the city came and smashed them down. So this suggests that there are a lot of visitors to Shoreditch, but of course there were also the people who worked in these places, who actually there's very little information about. So by the 1800s, you've got the theatres, music hall and penny gaffs developed. And then in 1900, Charles Booth reported that Hoxton is the leading criminal quarter of London and indeed of all England. So obviously all these visitors to the area were carrying things worth taking. But this also coincides with an area of extreme poverty. But that reputation of criminality persisted. And in the 1970s, in Quentin Crisp's Naked Civil Servant, he says to someone who he probably thinks should go back to that area, fuck off back to Hoxton. And in as early as 1609, there was a poem, "'Tis a Mad World at Hoxton." And one line from it says, "Doctors, proctors, clerks and attorneys to Pimlico made sweaty journeys." Pimlico was the tea gardens that was there before the Britannia musical or theatre was built. So obviously people were coming from a wide area to Hoxton. And you sort of think about recent times where very similar things have been happening, coming to Hoxton for entertainment. And we've come to the second synonymous, which is Bedlam, or the Asylums. And by 1700, 50% of London asylums were in Hoxton. And remember, these were often private, well, always private asylums. And they were pretty dreadful. There was the very, very notorious Whitmore House, where the violence and unpleasant treatment of the poor inmates was absolutely notorious. There was Hoxton House that was a stone's throw from Hoxton Square. But this image shows the Hoxton Coffee House. And this was on Hoxton Square itself. And it's where people who were assessed as being mad, the term at the time was lunatics. I mean, there's all sorts of expressions, but obviously in mental distress, were made even more mentally distressed by being tied up and paraded to the punters in the coffee house, who would decide whether they should be locked up in the asylum or not. I mean, it was a extremely unpleasant business. This is a map, and it shows the size of just one of these asylums. This is Hoxton House Lunatic Asylum. Hoxton Square is just here. This is Hoxton Street. And you can see the amount of space it took up. This is where the community college is now. And that whole stretch was asylum. There are very large numbers of patients who were, of course, often very badly treated, especially in the early days. While we're on this map, I just want to point out one thing that when I was looking at it, I picked up on, because later we'll be talking about industries in Hoxton. And one of the enduring industries was printers. And I just happened to notice here where I put the stars, there's actually three printers. 2 of them are printers, and one are wallpaper stainers, which made wallpaper. In a very small space, there's 3 of them. So we'll refer to that one later on. But into this bare pit that was the asylums, you had someone who I've got tremendous respect for, and I urge people to sort of read up more about him. 1 Hoxton Square, James Parkinson was born and bred in Hoxton Square. He was born in 1755. And he was a secular man, but he had a real social conscience. He advocated for the underprivileged. I think he was probably one of the very, very early practitioners of public health. He supported universal suffrage and legal rights for people with mental ill health. And he practiced as a doctor locally, and he made tremendous improvements in conditions in local asylums and also the local workhouse at St Leonard's. He's a tremendous man. When you actually read about him and the things he was interested in, he's got an interesting tale to tell. And just one Hoxton Square, which is still standing today. And after Parkinson and the family moved on, it became a cabinet factory, then an upholstery works, and then towards the end of the 1990s, it became the bass clef jazz club, and then became the Blue Note. And it's said that one of the reasons for the area's music reputation in those years was because of the Blue Note. What Parkinson's is most famous for is identifying Parkinson's disease, which at the time he called the shaking palsy, which was the first time he actually identified a condition rather than it just being dismissed as a number of just health concerns or whatever. And the other thing that there was a large number of at the same time in Hoxton was almshouses. So here's Hoxton Square. You had an almshouse. This is where the town hall is, and there was an almshouse just here. Of course, up here you've got the Jeffrey Museum that's still standing, and here you've got the Haberdashers' Almshouse, which is now flats, but the building is still there. So you can just see that Hoxton Square was actually surrounded by asylums, almshouses, and the beginning of industry. And this is the way that the area began to dominate, with industry to the south in this area, and to the north, poor quality housing for the workers. And so the well-to-do took flight. You were sandwiched between those two areas, and they took flight no less than from Hoxton Square. This was when a slum from Hoxton, or from Shoreditch, was dismantled and taken lock, stock and barrel to a building exhibition at Olympia. And you can see the conditions in these. They were sort of very much sort of shacks that people were living in. This is a corner shop, and this is the back of one of the very bad slums in Hoxton. And beneath their statistics, these statistics relate to about 1940, I expect. And it's talking about the overcrowding in the area, and it's absolutely true that there were families living many to one room, and that overcrowding was a real problem. And it's Shoreditch, Stepney, Bethnal Green, Finsbury, the four boroughs with the highest proportion of overcrowding, and that's exactly what you'd expect with those levels of poverty. One thing I love about these photos is the ladies. You'll see these are typical Hoxton slum dwellers. You'll see them posing complete with high heels and stockings. Doesn't quite fit. But one thing it says down here on the right, the old backyard so dearly loved by the slum dweller. When you talk to people who were living in those conditions, one of the things you soon learn is they were often growing things and had chickens and things in the backyard. It was their little bit of nature. And it was a really important part of their lives. And so when, going into flats, I mean, this was obviously the early slums, but the one thing that was missed is the yards. They were really important, and important for people to bring nature into a very drab area. So, industrial development. In the early years, the stink industries had to leave the city. They were squeezed out. They were making a smell. People were complaining, and they went into neighbouring areas. and there wasn't much that was smellier than soap making and also tannery. And both came to Shoreditch. This is a soap manufacturer opposite Shoreditch Church, so that would be just round the corner from Hoxton, where Hoxton Square was built. There was also a huge vinegar factory, Sarson's, many people will know, just where the Old Street Roundabout is, on that corner with City Road. And this was the one in Brunswick Place, which is still there. It was established in 1794, and this invoice, as you can see, is from 1921, so it's another industry that was there for a very, very long time. And there are also foundries. This is Clark Hunt and Co Limited that became Nichols and Clark's, and they were around from 1828 to about 2000. I can remember buying a sink from them, and these are their adverts. And this is a typical coal hole cover that they produce that you can still see in local pavements. The other big industry I mentioned, tanning, and of course from that became a boot and shoemaking industry. And this is an advert from about 1930 of a company called Norman's that was established in 1865. And again, it's still going strong many years later. And there's still shoe shops, wholesalers in Shoreditch, which comes straight from that past and has been there almost 200 years now. And on the right, the other industry was clothing industry. Again, a lot of it was piecework done at home, as well as in small workshops. But this photo is from two local ladies who actually also made their own clothes at home. They were expert seamstresses, and they made their own, and of course later their children's clothes. And this is just an image to show that you've got your snappy dresses in Hoxton as much as anywhere else. And the reputation that Hoxton have, you wouldn't think that these were people on a beano from Hoxton. Now I come to my synonymous 3, which is furniture. In 1820, when they built the Regent's Canal through the north of Hoxton, it is north of Hoxton. Originally, the canal brought in building materials, including loads of timber, to build all the buildings along the canal. But of course, they then needed furniture. And so you got the huge timber yards. And when I talk to people about timber yards, it is difficult to envisage the size of them. But this fantastic photo from the Canal Museum shows the scale of the timber yards, the amount of timber that there was. And you'll see there's 4 boats still delivering. And this photo was taken in 1907. I've just done a crop just to show the people on the boats, because one of the things that characterises Hoxton is hard graft, and you can just see there what the hard graft actually meant, carrying very, very heavy weights, huge amounts of timber. And of course Hoxton was ideally placed for the timber trade. It was close to the city, halfway between the canal and the city. It was near enough to transport and trade timber, furniture, but at the same time it was far enough away from the city for there to be low rents. And so the area became the centre of the English furniture making industry for 100 years. And all over Hoxton, and it's no exaggeration to say all over Hoxton, there were things going on relating to the furniture trade, or cabinet making trade as it was often called. You had factories and sawmills, certainly down Curtain Road, that were relatively large, but you also had dozens of sweatshops where very small numbers of people worked in very poor conditions, sometimes in basements without ventilation. And you also had the garret master system, where people would work from home. And when we say home, this might have been 1 or 2 rooms with dozens of people living there, and sawdust absolutely everywhere. And they had this system where some people only made, for example, legs of tables. They just turned endless legs of tables and never made the complete product. And all over Shoreditch there are these barrows, which I'll show you one will come up in a future slide, where they used to trundle through the streets with these legs of tables or backs of chairs or whatever, or seats, to the place where they'd be put together. And it was very much piecework and not necessarily that reliable. But this photo is a lovely photo, and the next one as well, because it shows, this is the Liberal candidate, and I think it must have been about 1920. This is the Liberal candidate for MP who was doing a tour of Hoxton and made sure he had all his publicity people in place. And here he is visiting a workshop. And the next slide shows at the other end of the trade, this was taken in Essex Street, I think, which is one of the poorest streets in Shoreditch. And the other end of the trade, you got all the offcuts and bits that were still valuable. Nothing was wasted, and it was often women and children would bundle up the timber and sell them as kindling. And this is obviously a wood seller being approached for her vote. He didn't win, so he obviously didn't get it. But it wasn't all work and no play. This is Leibovitch Furniture Company, which was at 23 to 31 Hoxton Square. And this is their Beano in 1925, and you can see all the workers up there for their day out. Around that time, well, in 1914, there were 66 cabinet makers working in Hoxton Square. So you can see the size of the trade. And there was also a booth again in 1899 said Hoxton Square is almost entirely given over to cabinet makers. The mayor of Shoreditch at one stage was a cabinet maker, and he showed the king around the area, and he was sort of asked, "What do you do?" And he said very, very proudly, "I'm a cabinet maker." And people were proud of their work. The work was of all levels, of course. Some of it was very cheap and very, very cheap furniture, and some of it was highly crafted reproduction and antiques of the future. It all happened in Hoxton. This is another image of the inside of a workshop. This was about 1960, I think. And one thing you can see there is it looks very Victorian piece of equipment. And one of the reasons why the furniture trade left Hoxton was because of the mechanisation of the timber industry, things like sawmills, etc. And so a lot of it moved out to the River Lee. And on the right is one of my favourite adverts. This is from about 1930, and it's just outside Hoxton Square. It's at the top of Rufus Street, over the other side of Old Street, and they made these Lotiner cabinets. Of course, when places were small and crowded, it was invaluable to have something that you could fold away. And one of the reasons that I'm showing you this is you'll see it wasn't just timber that was used. There was also a number of companies that made things associated with the trade, such as all the door fittings, the knobs, and also mirrors. There's the fantastic Goddard and Gibbs glass factory round the corner from Hoxton Square. And, of course, all the polishes. And this was in St George's Mills in Hoxton Square. They made shellac polishes and varnishes. And you'll see they're also sole distributors to the hat trade, so they were multitasking at the same time. But having run through all the work there was a lot of work that wasn't. One of the biggest jobs in Hoxton was ducking and diving. A lot of the jobs were either seasonal, or when there was a demand and you got an order, people were taken on, or otherwise they were laid off. And so a lot of your time was walking around the streets looking for signs in window saying that there was work available. and that was not always easy to get. And so that did leave a large amount of poverty. Now, Hoxton is synonymous with poverty. I haven't seen it said so, but it's my synonymous with poverty, because at that time, and this is about 1900, when you had the Booth maps, poverty maps, you'll see that it was said the character of the whole locality is working class, poverty is everywhere. And in this system, anything red or pink is relatively well-to-do. You'll see that along the main roads, it was more or less okay, but directly you got in the back streets, including here you've got Hoxton Square. The blue symbolises poverty, and the black, the black's about the lowest you can go. And you can see there's a fair amount of that in Hoxton at that time. And this is, and it says, this is an artist's impression of the inside of a Shoreditch house, where one room was shared between two families, 4 adults and 7 children, and food was mostly eaten at a fried fish shop. And this, the bed, you'll see someone asleep on the bed. There was almost there were rotas to sleep in the bed at the time, and people working shift work and things. It was not uncommon for people to be not necessarily the same family to be sharing beds. Having said that, Shoreditch people were quite capable of leading rich lives. I think it's when life's hard, it's even more worth celebrating life. And so you've got a whole history of both the entertainments, going to the theatre, etc., going to the local library, etc., and celebrations. And this is an image from the graphic of May Day in Hoxton in 1901. And you'll see both there all dressed up, but also the old carts that were used to wheel round the furniture, or even the dust carts, were all brought into use, in this case filled with children, and a big celebration. And this other image is of a fancy dress ball in Shoreditch Town Hall in 1916 that was raising funds for disabled soldiers. And I'm sure most of those were, well, virtually all of them would be handmade dresses, and you'll see there's one clown. There's a bit of a theme of clowns coming up. But you wouldn't expect those sorts of images of Shoreditch unless you lived there and knew that was your community. And my next synonymous is self-help. Again, it's not a public one. This is my personal one. The old vestry, Shoreditch Vestry, and then the Metropolitan Borough of Shoreditch was one of the most progressive boroughs. In 1866, they built the grandest vestry hall in London, and it was a scene of everything from boxing matches to entertainments, etc. They also had one of the first municipal housing schemes. The first one, I think, was LCC, but down by Niles Street they had a scheme. It had the first technical institute in London to train people in the building and furniture trades. And it also did what's popularly called gas and water socialism. It actually looked at improving the plight of local people, and it built the dust destructor. Now, most people will have seen, and if you haven't, I would urge you to, the old electricity generating station in Hoxton Market, which is now home to Circus Space. It was built in 1897, and this is the back. There's 2 gates in Hoxton Square, and they lead through to the back of the generating station where they'd have had deliveries. And in the station, they actually famously used household rubbish or household dust. And at the time, in 1897, there was little that was rubbish. Everything was reused. So most of the dust was actually the remains from coal fires, etc. And so they burnt it to create steam, which then generated the electricity. And the electricity was used very much for local people. There was street lighting, but also in particular, part of this complex was a public library, a public baths and washrooms. And here's the Shoreditch emblem, which is more light, more power, and an old cigarette card. The generating station went on till 1940, so again it was quite a long-running facility. And this is inside. This is the turbine hall. You can see the size of the machines that were in there. And if you visit Circus Space now, you can see these beautiful walls still standing. Of course, it's very high, that allows them to use the trapezes and things. And there was a tremendous pride in this work. And so here you see an electrical exhibition in Pitfield Street, Baths, in 1904, put on by Shoreditch, which shows all the latest technology, high technology of the time, to promote the advantages of clean and easy electricity to provide warmth and hot water that were such a rarity in local homes. Here's the outside of the Baths, beautiful building, and here's the inside. You can see that's a swimming gala, but of course they also had individual baths where people could literally wash themselves. And there's lots of stories about the shenanigans that went on in them. Different things being shouted over the doors and people shouting the wrong numbers so someone else got hot water in. But they were very, very welcome. Unfortunately, the baths were bombed during the war and were actually demolished in 1962. Some of it remains at the side of the generating station. You just where there's a car park, you can still see some of the tiles from the old baths. You might still be able to see it if the vegetation hasn't covered it over. I took that photo some time ago. And while we're on Hoxton Square, Hoxton Market, it wasn't only the vestry and the borough that was doing good works. Poverty attracts do-gooders from all over the place, and Hoxton was no exception. They were of a mixed levels of welcomeness accompanied them. But one particular service that I haven't heard a bad word said against, and in Hoxton, bad words can be said quite easily. People don't hold their tongues. But the one that everyone seems to love and respect was Daddy Bert's, or the Hoxton Christian Mission. And this is a scene from outside it, and you can see they provided so much to local people. They fed them, they clothed them, and they gave them treats at Christmas and outings and space to shelter from homelessness for some of them. And it was run by two brothers, and the brothers themselves had been orphans, and one of them was actually crippled by having to carry pails of milk on his shoulders, and it virtually crippled his legs. So they had a real understanding of poverty. It wasn't a sort of patronising or naive understanding of it. And one of the things they did was provide boots, but it was only on condition that the children brought in their old boots, because they knew that if they didn't take the old ones away, they continue using them and would sell, because people were so poor, the new boots. And just here in my book, I give a lot more information about it, but in 1920 you can see the number of meals that they gave and garments distributed, and including boots. And Daddy Bert's continued to provide that service for over 50 years, and it continues to be loved by local people. And there's lots of stories of it. And this is just, if you go on, there's a number of Hoxton sites on Facebook. This one is memories of Hoxton, Shoreditch. And every now and again someone will post an image relating to Daddy Bert's. and you'll get the comments. And these are just two very typical ones. One of them is the classic, my mum used to talk fondly of Daddy Bert's, as everyone did. And this one, where we got free dinners, then we went round the back and exchanged jackets, queued up and went back in again. And there's all sorts of tales of strokes being pulled relating to Daddy Bert's and indeed other institutions in Hoxton. And this brings us to the 1950s. This is a Goad insurance plan. And I thought this is very pertinent because he's actually put this sheet is now obsolete. And in some ways, it's a symptom of what was happening to the square at that time. I've put crosses, red crosses, on, you can see 4 sites there, where they were vacant premises and a couple of them were war damaged and derelict as a result of war damage. But it's also interesting to see what was actually also there at the time. And you'll see there's a lot of the old industries hanging on. There's a cabinet factory there, curtain factory there. There's a clothes warehouse up here, cabinet factory there, furniture warehouse, timber store. So there's a lot of the old that are still there. And here, of course, you've got a timber yard, Coronet Timber Yard, which would be the site of the Lux Cinema, which I'll talk about later. But here's an advert for the Coronet Timber Yard. And just look at the range of woods that they actually dealt with. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful woods. And beautiful craftsmanship that was used with these woods that has always been in Hoxton. And one thing just to draw your attention to, you'll see that they also had a wharf at Laburnum Wharf, where they would have got the timber off the canal. So that link was still there, and this was in the about 1950s, I think, this advert. And here's a photo from the Hackney archives from the 1960s. And you'll see by this stage, while we've got some of the industries hanging on, this is a high-grade furniture factory or warehouse. And next door you've got a plastics factory advertising for mica, again in one of the beautiful old houses still standing. Hoxton was changing. In the post-war period, it was a bit unclear what would happen or what was happening. But one thing for sure is there were still local people living there. Again, all the photos of the period always show sort of derelict buildings with nothing going on. And these are wonderful photos that were taken in 1965 by a photographer called John Clear of some of the local youngsters who were involved with the Hoxton Cafe. It was an interesting project, and I'll put the website link. The links are in the text beneath the video, but we'll also be sending them round, emailing them round afterwards. And it was very much sort of project, but it was run by fantastic people who had all sorts of pop stars, and Sterling Moss went there, and all sorts of people went to visit the cafe. And it was meant to be for youths who were unclubbable. But of course it proved that they were, if given the opportunity, they were very willing to join in. And one thing, Gordon, who runs the website, very kindly marked for me on a map of Hoxton Square where these buildings were. Because you'll see this one here, which is a magnificent building. You can just see limited on the end of there, but Hoxton Square there. It's very difficult to see where it actually was, and of course it is now demolished. It's where the school was. So this blue dot here is this building, and this one, when they're in the basement of one of the buildings, was actually here. So they're both buildings that are long gone. I haven't seen another photo of this one. So what was happening between the 60s and the 80s, where if you listen to the people who sort of moved in at the end of that period, you would think there was absolutely nothing going on. But there were a number of youth projects. Hoxton's got a wealth of boys clubs which actually then are now both sexes. But there was certainly a lot of sports going on, and things like trips away, etc. But there was also a fair amount of art that took place and art exhibitions in the youth projects. May Scott, who is much appreciated locally, ran a community theatre at Hoxton Hall, and this bottom photo shows some of the local kids taking part in an activity at Hoxton Hall. There was also Freeform, who brought community arts to Shoreditch, and you can see their Caribbean House. That was a beautiful work of art with using mosaics just by Shoreditch Park. You also had from 1979 the Shoreditch Festival. But I've included it here, although it wasn't community arts, although it was within the arts community. In the 1960s, Bridget Riley was running a sort of ad hoc property agency where she was linking artists with cheap studio space in Shoreditch. And that was as early as the 60s. And there's an image of the Shoreditch Festival. There's the programme on the right, and on the left you can see that's Jean there, flashing her saucy schoolgirl outfit. And again, local people have no reticence in dressing up for occasions. And the Shoreditch Festival ran well into the 80s with a fire show and festivals and other events. It organised, for example, a darts tournament in Shoreditch Town Hall when it was still closed up. And now we've come almost to modern times, and another synonymous, 5, when Hoxton became synonymous with the Young British Artists, or the YBAs. And we're now into the sort of 1990s, when you had, actually in 1994, the first Fate Worse Than Death. The roll call of Young British Artists, all the names you can think of, plus a number of designers. Alexander McQueen is one most people will know. Lived in Hoxton, in many cases in Hoxton Square as well. And this is Joshua Compton, who was sort of seen as one of the leaders of the movement and started the Fates Worse Than Death. And there he's being interviewed in Hoxton Square and the assorted masses. I actually went to the Fate Worse Than Death, and it was actually very enjoyable. This is Damien Hirst flashing his tackle for 50 pence a look. I actually much preferred a stall where which was called Jackson's Bollocks, where you had balloons filled with paint, and if you threw a dart on them and they exploded, you created your own Jackson Pollock and got a little effigy as a reward. But why did Hoxton become this sort of mecca for artists, and this much famed mecca for artists as well? There are other meccas, but they're not nearly so famous. And just quickly running through it, one of the reasons was that Covent Garden had been quite a centre of creativity, but it had been regenerated, so people were moving out. Hoxton was cheap and central. It had large, well-lit industrial buildings, and that linked with industrial chic that was very fashionable. Also, planning was very weak. That issue about live-work, where at one time you couldn't do both, and that was fading away. The street pattern of Hoxton, with its sort of village feel, the very narrow streets and things like pubs and infrastructure, was very appealing. And you also had the infrastructure linked with the heritage. There were printers, there were frame makers, there were people who made clothes in Hoxton. So some of the infrastructure you needed was already there. There's a creative stimulation from places that are in a state of flux, and in many ways Hoxton has always been in a state of flux. But the other thing I think is important is hyperability. And marketing had just sort of come on the scene then, and social media was very embryonic. And certainly there was a great deal of hype about Hoxton. And just an example of marketing, even Hoxton was getting in on marketing. This is a Hoxton Square industry that was producing all your means at the time of marketing, displays and posters, etc. I've nearly finished, but then we had a period in about just before 2000, into 2000, when regeneration struck in Hoxton. And some of this was very good and some of it was pretty dreadful. One of the things that was less successful was the Lux Cinema that was moved into Hoxton Square. These things were sort of helicoptered in to the area. They weren't generic to the area at all. And of course it lasted from 1997 to 2001. Although I lived there at the time, I didn't go there once. It tended to show art films. And of course it was given the money for the building, but not running costs. And it went bankrupt. I've got to say they were going to run a season of women's porn films that a friend of mine and I discussed whether we ought to go and see them. And then just when we were about to decide, we found out they'd had to cancel it because of local protests about it becoming a porn cinema. But that's by the by. Circus Space was another project that was sort of parachuted in, possibly in their case with Circus Tales, literally. And this has been a very successful project. It arrived in 1997, is still going strong. And this figure in Hoxton Market is actually a statue that was put there to commemorate Shoreditch's the Shoreditch tradition of entertainment and music halls. So that links with Circus Space as well. It's called the Juggler. And of course, the White Cube was part of that whole, both responding to the artists in the area, but also regenerating the area. So interestingly, it represented the YBAs, but priced out the next generation. And it was there from 2000 to 2012. Not without its critics. These are the Stuckists, who complained very much about, they called it the tyranny or whatever, of the white wall system of art galleries, and also declared that artists who don't paint aren't artists. I must admit I have some bit of sympathy with them. But they had their own gallery round the corner, and that was them carrying their coffin, the death conceptual art, outside the White Cube. And of course you can't say much about the way Hoxton went without mentioning the estate agents. This is one of the things that's slightly irritating. It's talking about a building, Hoxton born and bred, but then when you look at the building, it's a brand new building, possibly on something that was a better quality or whatever, and it's using the Hoxton tag without really contributing anything to it. And if you look at the prices, you'll see why. And in a way, so what? The artists arrive and everything was hunky-dory and it became the home of the YBAs, etc. And I just want to talk a bit about what it actually meant for people who'd always lived there and still live there, because there's a disparity between the incoming cultures and economy and the residential community. Many were priced out of housing while the nighttime economy pisses on your doorway. Jobs move away, but also importantly, a lot of those warehouses that people thought were empty and not being used actually did have a local people doing little start-ups in them and giving them a foot on the ladder. But that all disappeared when they could no longer afford to rent them. Heritage is dismissed as nostalgia or Disneyfied. And there's also a lot of insulting language was used. People who discovered Hoxton, and there was actually a quote in a national paper that it was known more for its bomb sites than its culture. But what goes around comes around, and in the article for the Hackney Society, I said that the Hoxton twat bewailed the faux artists who moved in, who drove out the genuine creatives. And now in turn, the wheels turned again, and here we have Silicone Roundabout. Always a pretty dreadful part of Hoxton, but suddenly it's become desirable. I've put on Nobody Loves Me, and Google does. It's interesting the way it came about. There were various regeneration projects that poured money into IT initiatives, pretty dismal and very expensively. But guess what? It happened anyway. And in 2010, the government announced plans to transform London's East End into a technology incubator to rival Silicon Valley. And I now understand, I think we're third behind San Francisco and New York City in the world ranking for tech startups. So it's a new area, and who knows where it will lead. So I'm just going to end on one slide, which is an image from 1902 of the drinking fountain in Hoxton Square, and you can see in the background St Monica's still standing, and you could almost take that photo today. And that's the importance. In Hoxton Square there are 10 listed buildings and 10 buildings that are identified in the South Shoreditch Conservation Area. And it's so important that these things are protected to give that continuity. I hope I've shown how over the years things come and go, one thing feeds another. But it's important that some things remain. I think the only thing what's not important that should remain is you'll see there the little lead cup they used to chain to drinking fountains. I think in the day of COVID that would probably have been removed, and it's a part of heritage it should be. But just a plea to keep those remnants of Hoxton's past alive, so that people can understand the traditions and the history. And thank you for listening.
Good evening, everyone. I'm sorry for the false start there, technical glitch. My name's Ray Blackburn. I'm from the Hackney Society, and I hope you just enjoyed a fascinating tour through the story of Hoxton Square and the surrounding area. I'm here with Carolyn Clark. We'll take your questions in a couple of minutes. First of all, just a little bit about the Hackney Society for those who don't know. We're concerned with the built environment in Hackney, both old and new. We want to press for high standards of design and preservation. We're trying to interest local people in getting involved and interested in this, and we have three main strands. We're involved in the planning process with Hackney Council. We have a series of publications, which involves a quarterly newsletter called Spaces and a series of books. The latest book has just been published this year, Women from Hackney's History. This is a book about women connected with Hackney, and it's written by women from Hackney. We also have events, walks, talks and visits. At the moment, these are online. The next event is on the 29th of June. It's a talk by the photographer, Chris Dawley-Brown. And Chris has spent over 30 years studying and researching the story of Hackney Wick and photographing it. And so we'll be taking a look at illustrations over that period, looking at a series of photographs which chart the course that Hackney Wick has undergone and the changes it's experienced in that time. You can book on this talk, as you see on the screen now. You can book tonight, and it's no charge with an optional donation. You can also go on our mailing list to hear about upcoming events, and you can join the Hackney Society as well for a discount on books and the quarterly newsletter Spaces. Now, back to tonight's talk and questions for Carolyn. Carolyn is, as well as being a community historian, she has lived in Shoreditch. She was the first secretary of the Shoreditch Festival with that saucy picture from 1979. She has written about Shoreditch, and more recently the book Shoreditch Tales, which collects stories, illustrations and people's memories of Shoreditch. There are also books about the Regent's Canal in that part of London and Lower Clapton. You can buy all these books from the website shoreditchtales.com. Now, as you will have seen from the talk, Carolyn has a wealth of knowledge about Shoreditch. and we have some questions for her. The first one is from Judith Brown, and it's, Carolyn, you were talking about Hoxton and then Shoreditch. Could you tell us where Shoreditch ends and Hoxton begins?
It's a good question, and one, it's only, Shoreditch is very elastic, especially nowadays where it seems to cover Brick Lane as well. Technically, I'll start just with Shoreditch because Hoxton is part of Shoreditch. It goes from the canal down to the boundary with the city, and then on the eastern side, it's more or less the Hackney Road with a bit round the back of Shoreditch Church. And on the west side, it's Wharf Road, Wenlock Base, and the boundary with Islington. And there's two significant areas within Shoreditch. The Hoxton itself covers west of Kingston Road, right across to Wenlock Barn, Wiston Road, Wenlock Barn, and Haggerston is the other component of Shoreditch, which is the other side of Kingston Road. So my brief was really to talk about Hoxton Square and the surrounding area, so I didn't really refer to the whole of Hoxton or indeed Shoreditch, although I realise I use some of them interchangeably. But Hoxton is west of Kingston Road.
Thank you, Carolyn. Now, a question from Sasha Chandri. What's your source, please, for the Hoxton Academy based at number 32 Hoxton Square, I presume, in 1699? Could you give us a source for that?
There's several sources. If you look up on the web on dissenting academies, there's quite a lot about it. There's also Hackney Archives that's got a number of materials, references to it in different records, and there's also some of the churches themselves. The Nonconformist Church have very good archives. But if she wants to contact me, I'll actually give her a book reference.
Thank you. A question from Andy Washington. One of the maps you showed had Old Street called Old Street Road. When was Old Street not old?
I'm sorry, the old maps vary significantly. I think that's possibly the only one that's actually called Old Street Road, because everywhere else it's called Old Street. But before that, it was Ermine Street was Kingston Road, which was the old Roman road, and Old Street wasn't called Old Street until quite late on, but that was in recognition that it was a Roman road. It was the sort of North Circular of its time before London spread.
Thank you. Now then, Janice Pearson is asking, Mounties, what's that about? yeah, I'm afraid there's a large number of us was always longing to spot some. It was just the Bob Bream Academy, which is a martial arts gym that was is now operating from Hackney Community College, I think, but it was actually in 16 Hoxton Square, and it had the contract to train Canadian Mounties in martial arts or fighting skills, defence skills. I don't think they actually turned up in uniform. I don't think we had due south in the middle of Hoxton Square, but that was one of the groups among many, I'm sure, that it trained. Okay, no Monty Python connection then. No, it'd be nice, wouldn't it? Okay, so Chris Sansom asks, forgiving our ignorance, but what are the ragged queens? Well, it was one of the terms for, I suppose nowadays they'd be called prostitutes or women of the night or whatever. I mean, for those who watched the programme, or what was it called recently on television, that showed whorehouses in Soho or whatever, but they basically were selling their wares, and
I think it's quite a nice word for them, raggy queens.
And this is a question stroke comment from John Finn. John says, I was a member of a community design co-op in the 1980s looking for cheap premises, and we found Hoxton Square a bit expensive.
Oh, yes. Yeah, well, there's always somewhere cheaper, but I'm sure there are many places more expensive. You now find it a lot more expensive.
Do you think the same people who moved into Hoxton Square at a certain point then went beyond into Hackney, Dalston, and now are going over the Lee and farther out?
Oh, yes. I mean, they're priced. It's true if you look at the artistic quarters over London over time. People are priced out and they go to the next one. I know that lots went to Tottenham, Hackney Wick, Fish Island, wherever there's affordable places, and I'm afraid they're all disappearing as well. So as well as local people now being priced out of the market, artists without wealthy families are also priced out of the market.
That's a good link to our next event that I mentioned, which is all about Hackney Wick. So we can connect those two together, I think. I've got a question from John Smith, and it says you talked at one point about the bathhouse and library, about them being popular. Do you have any more detail on that? Any more information?
I did in my notes, which I missed. The bathhouse had 115 baths, which shows how desperately needed and popular they were. But one of the most interesting things that was in 1930, that library was issuing 1,491 books per day. And there was also a library in Kingston Road, just up by the Canal, and that was also issuing a similar number. I've actually got the number of that one in my books, but you can see that people were desperate for books to read, and they would have all been local residents.
Talking of local residents, I wonder, without giving too much away and stopping people buying the book, I mean, what kind of how far could you go back talking to people who had a real life experience about living in the area?
Well, I mean, when the people I spoke to, and I've spoken to very many people going back to the 1970s, so there were people. I mean, I edited a community newspaper called Shoreditch Views, and we interviewed some people as part of that, and that was in the 80s, and there were people who were sort of from 1900 then, but there are also, I mean, there are all history interviews and records of people who go back further than that, so there are around, and there's quite a few references in the book.
Another question here. In terms of the area having had a reputation as being slightly racy over quite a considerable time, what was there always a sort of a crime problem, a crime aspect to this?
Well, there's a lot of dodgy things going on, a lot of sort of fencing stuff. A lot of stuff got nicked, fell off the back of a lorry. I mean, not all dangerously criminal. I mean, one man I met who worked in the timber trade. He showed me the doll's house furniture he'd made for his daughter, but that was obviously from wood from the factory, but it's probably willingly given. There's some fantastic stories about a Hoxton Square, and behind it there was a square not many people know about called George Square, that were quite racy at the time when there was the illegal betting trade, and there would have been people, bookies and their lookouts, a large number of, say, 6 people at a time being employed to take illegal bets. And there's a lovely story about how the police turned up one day trying to catch them, and they dressed up as dressed up as road sweepers or something, anything but to appear to be policemen. And it was right at the last minute people realised it, and then jumped over the walls and disappeared into George Square and beyond. Some people said it wasn't fun anymore once they made betting legal, because you didn't have all those sort of shenanigans. But there was definitely, I mean, the craze came from Shoreditch originally. I know they moved into Bethnal Green, but you had a certain tradition there as well.
Okay, folks, we're looking to wrap up the evening round about 8:30. So you've got a few minutes left if you have any more questions for Carolyn. Remember, log into YouTube and use the chat facility, and we'll transfer the question over and ask her.
Yeah.
Here we go. Sorry.
Can I just say, there were a couple of things when I was watching the film back. Well, quite a few things. I kept seeing etc. for one thing, but interestingly, I got wrong the Monteagle thing when I said it was a Hoxton quiff, when of course it was a Hoxton fin. And in many ways that reflects it was actually quite a long time ago now when you had those Hoxton hipsters sort of arriving. Now they've all been morphed into, they've still got beards, but they've sort of morphed into another group. And I haven't seen a Hoxton fin for probably a decade or more.
Okay. Now I've got a question from Kevin Moore. Who are the most famous current Hoxton residents, would you say? Kevin says, I always remember dancing next to Björk at the Blue Note in the 90s.
Yeah. Well, actually, I don't know many Hoxton residents. The ones that were famous, like Tracy Emin and all the YBAs are no longer there. I expect you'd have to be very wealthy to live in Hoxton, and I think there are a few. There are definitely a few pop music stars who live there, but I don't know.
I guess these days, you're not always aware that you are next to somebody famous, are you? Somebody might have to point it out. It happens to me like that.
Yes, yeah, quite.
Now, Paul Deployen, I hope I pronounced that. Paul Deployen. Is there a statue of Arthur Morrison, the slum clearance campaigner?
Not to my knowledge in Shoreditch. There might be elsewhere, but there were actually a lot of heroes in Hoxton. One I didn't mention, which was one of the very early ones, was Thomas Fairchild, who was the market gardener, who was actually very aware of the poverty between them and insisted that he should be buried in Hoxton along with those people. And I mentioned Daddy Burt, but there's been no shortage of people who have done a lot for the area. But I wouldn't underestimate the number of people from Hoxton themselves. The tenants associations in Hoxton are absolutely amazing. I used to call them the battling queens, people like Carol Young and Mary McCourt, and over in Haggerston as well, Doreen Bullock, etc., who really fight for improvements on the estates and provide a lot of services to their tenants, and that's people doing it for themselves.
Okay. I'm just thinking now, last time I was in Hoxton Square, a lot of people were taking selfies and photographs by the new sculpture there, the holding hands sculpture.
Oh, Sticks.
It's a good, yes. I think that's a good addition to the square.
I don't mind it because it's presumably temporary. It's different people's tastes, and I expect it does well for the local businesses. I just wish they would employ more local people. Okay. Thanks, Carolyn.
I think that's probably the end of the questions that are coming in.
Okay.
Can I just say a big thank you to you, Carolyn Clark, for your fascinating tour. Your books, Shoreditch Tales, Lower Clapton Tales, and East End Canal Tales, are all available via the website shoreditchtales.com. The links that I've referred to and that link about the books are in the description below the video that people are watching, and in some of the screens that you're picking up now. The YouTube video is available for a short time at least afterwards, and you'll get the links underneath the video there also. Oh, there's also a Regent's Canal website with lots more information about the Regent's Canal, that part of it which cuts across Hackney. Thanks everybody for coming to view the talk, and thanks if you've made a donation. We're very grateful. Thanks for that, and thanks again, Carolyn, and we'll see you again soon. Good night.